Hello, everyone. We're back with the Encyclopedia of the Ancient World, and we're going to cover the last several dynasties of the Egyptian empires. Um, and we're going to do that fairly quickly. And we're going to start with the third intermediate period, okay? And again, these intermediate periods are usually times of chaos and confusion, and this one is no different. The glory days of Egypt have long passed. There's going to show, we're going to look at, wave after wave of foreign rulers are coming in. And it all kind of starts with the death of Ramses the 11th. He dies in about 1069 BC, and he leaves two very powerful men in Egypt at this time. Both of these men are probably sons of Herihor. The first one is Smendes, and he is in the capital of Per-Ramses. And then you have Punijum, who's the high priest at Thebes, okay? And these two men, like I said, very powerful, both feeling very much like they deserve the throne. And so then you have Smendes, who out of the blue kind of just decides, you know what, I'm going to be king. And he moves his capital to Tanis, and he is there in Tanis, and he starts to start building like the buildings and things that they have in Thebes, to include temples to Armon and to Mut. And this is where the start of the founding of the 21st dynasty begins, okay? So you have Smendes as the initial king of the 21st dynasty. But you also have Penujum, who is, again, a very powerful person, believes he has the right to the throne. But initially he recognizes Smendes as a king. And that lasts for a little while. And then he decides, you know what, no, I'm king. So he declares himself to be king. And the Egyptian rule at this point is divided between Tanis and Thebes for over 100 years. Then we start, because of this division and the different problems that are still continuing to go on in Egypt during this time, this intermediate period, we start to have foreign rulers begin to take over. Initially, if the 22nd dynasty is with the Libyan rulers, okay, you have Sahushenk the first, who is the first Libyan ruler. He married his son to the heiress of Tanis. He was the commander-in-chief of the army, and in about 945 BC, he claims the title of pharaoh. And he's appointed the sun high priest at Thebes, which then unites all of Egypt under the Libyan dynasties. And at this point, they adopt a lot of the Egyptian ways, and he tries to regain the Egyptian empire and the whole greatness that it had and the land especially that it had. He starts to create raids into Palestine. He loots Jerusalem in around 925 BC and carries off several different treasures. But ultimately, the Libyans are not completely successful. They run into some problems with the Nubians, and Nubians were formerly freed themselves from Egyptian rule under the Ramses the 11th, okay? So when that confusion was going on. And they took advantage of the Libyan confusion. They pushed north into Egypt in around 728 BC, and they were led by a man named Pianki. They were all Amun worshippers. Remember, they were controlled by Egypt for such a long time that they adopted many of their ways, so they were all Amun worshippers. And like I said, they knew them from their time that they were, being ruled by Egypt. And they were actually more vehement believers of Amun than a lot of the Egyptians were. So you have Pianki, who sets himself up at Thebes, and he starts to fight with the princes in the Delta until they recognize him as king. And this started the 25th dynasty. Around the same time period, you have Assyria in the Near East starting to rise up, and it's starting to change the balance of power in the area. The Assyrians become a major power, and around 750 BC, they start to control a large part of Mesopotamia and Palestine. Now, these Nubian kings are trying to expand their power, and they unite with the kings of Palestine to fight the Assyrians. So ultimately, what's going on? The Assyrians are gaining power, trying to take over some areas. Some of the areas that the Nubians are trying to control, all part of the greater Egypt, right? And so they decide, you know what, let's join forces with this Palestine and the Palestinians and fight against the Assyrians. Well, that was a problem for the Nubians because now the Assyrians are looking at them and looking at Egypt. Eventually, the Assyrians decide to attack and invade the delta of Egypt, and they do this twice. They sack Thebes, and the Assyrians, because there's so much confusion going on in Egypt at this point, get help from the delta princesses. They march as far as Thebes in around 665 BC, and when they're doing so, they're just plundering and burning the temples, stealing, gold and artifacts. Eventually, you have Tanutamen, who was the king of the Egyptian, rule at that point, was forced to flee back to Nubia, and the Nubian rule in Egypt ends at that point. The Assyrians basically go home, and when they do so, they're expecting Egypt to pay tribute to them, which was very normal during that time period, right? So they leave expecting to get tribute. The princes don't like it, and they start to rebel. They start to not pay the tribute, and so that only lasts about a year for the Assyrians. Then we have the kings of Sais, and this is part of the delta area of Egypt, and the first one is Psamtik, and he refuses straight up. He's no longer playing games. He just says, we're done. We're not paying the Assyrians anything. And he proclaims himself king of Egypt in around 664 BC, and he reunites Egypt in a combined rule again, and he starts and forms the 26th dynasty. This time is also starts to be known as the late period, and it lasts around 150 years. Once again, during this time, Egypt is prospering. There's this whole make Egypt great again kind of thing going on. Lots of building work. They're trying to expand again. They're just, living pretty prosperously. And then you have Neku II, who is king. He becomes king during the 26th dynasty, and he starts constructing a canal between the Nile and the Red Sea. Eventually, you start having some more foreign rule. The Persians defeat the last king of Sais, Psamtik III, in around 525 BC. And the Persians at this point take complete control of Egypt. And they start ruling through their satraps, or local governors. And they're very unpopular rulers. They truly only rule from a distance. Most of the kings of Egypt at this time under the Persian rule never even visit Egypt. They're never even there. They've never seen Egypt. The only king to visit Egypt personally during this time is Cambyses II. Eventually, Darius follows Cambyses, and he makes an effort to be more fair and respectful of Egyptian customs and less nasty about how they're ruled. And the Persians rule for about 120 years. Then you have the Greeks starting to rise throughout the whole entire world, and they come to live in Egypt. Mostly not there trying to rule, because the Persians are still kind of there ruling, in theory. But the Greeks are living in Egypt as merchants, as mercenaries, and they're completely fascinated by Egyptian culture. And they adopt many of the Egyptian practices, and they start to form alliances with the Egyptians against the Persians. So then you start getting to the last of the Egyptian kings, and the Egyptians are constantly rebelling against the Persians. So in around 404 BC, they got rid of the Persians completely. And then we enter what's the final period, and this lasts only about 60 years. And it's filled with lots and lots of wars, many wars between the Greeks and the Egyptians and the Persians, and infighting amongst the Egyptians. So what you might say is Persian or civil type wars. Eventually, you have Artaxerxes II, who's a Persian king, and he completely, invades Egypt. And remember, these kings were not dealing with Egypt. They hadn't seen Egypt. They were just kind of trying to rule from a distance. So eventually, Artaxerxes II, the Persian king, invades Egypt. And the last Egyptian king who was trying to be king is forced to flee Egypt. Also during this time, you have the Macedonian Empire and Alexander the Great, who's coming to power in 334 BC. And he's swept into Egypt. And he basically gets rid of the Persians, fights the Persians, gets rid of them in around 332 BC. And he's welcomed in Egypt as a hero. Basically, they saved us from the Persians. One of the oracles declares Alexander the Great as the son of Amun. And he sets up a new capital named after himself, Alexandria, on the Mediterranean, Egypt. Unfortunately, he dies at the age of 32, and the empire is divided between 3 different generals. Ptolemy is the general who takes control of Egypt, okay? And then he and his descendants basically rule Egypt for over 300 years. All the kings, this is another one of those crazy times where, for a while everybody was named Ramses. Now for the next 300 years or so, all the kings are named Ptolemy. And all the queens are either named Cleopatra, Arsinoe, or Bernice. The Ptolemaic kings spoke only Greek. They made Greek the official language of all of Egypt, and they saw Greek culture as superior to the Egyptian culture, and they're trying to force the Greek culture on everybody. They also live in Egypt, and they try to please the Egyptian subjects by respecting some of the old traditions, and they also built in the Egyptian style. Then we start dealing with, different kings and queens, and you have the Romans starting to gain power across the Mediterranean by around 100 BC. The Macedonian Empire is starting to crumble under the Romans, and the Ptolemies are starting to acknowledge the power of the Romans, and there's some issues going on. The Roman Senate starts to dabble in Egyptian politics, okay? They're allowing the Ptolemies to remain rulers, but not really. They're starting to force the Roman way on them. So eventually we have war between the Ptolemies in around 51 BC. You have Cleopatra VII, who is the wife of the younger brother of Ptolemy XIII. And technically they're supposed to get married so they can rule together and whatever. And she says, no, thank you. I'm not interested in marrying him. So Ptolemy XIII and his advisors want a sole rule. And they start fighting with Cleopatra over power because she wants sole rule. And so war completely breaks out in Egypt at this time. And Julius Caesar is a Roman general, and he is basically sent and comes to Alexandria to work things out between the Ptolemies. And he's trying to figure out what's going on. And ultimately what's going on is you're having a fight between Cleopatra and a Ptolemy over power. Well, Julius Caesar is supposed to be settling things and non-biased, but he sees Cleopatra and basically falls in love with her. He is won over by her completely head over heels and becomes her lover, and together they kill the Ptolemy, which gives Cleopatra sole rule of Egypt. Julius Caesar eventually is killed, and Mark Antony is Caesar's friend, and he starts joining with Cleopatra. He ultimately becomes her lover as well, because apparently she is extremely beautiful and persuasive, and he begins to help her out as well. And then Octavian was Caesar's heir, and he didn't want any rivals in Egypt, so he goes to war with Cleopatra. And so there's war between Rome and Egypt, and between Octavian and Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Eventually, in Actium in around 31 BC, Octavian defeats Cleopatra and Mark Antony. And it's at that point they realize it's over. There's nowhere for them to go. There's nothing to do. So they create a death pact among themselves to avoid any more humiliation and whatever, and they decide to kill themselves. Mark Antony goes to the sword and takes his own life, and Cleopatra is poisoned with her snakes. Ultimately, at this point, Egypt becomes part of the Roman Empire, and it goes on from there to basically stay part of the Roman Empire and never really gain any more notoriety as an Egyptian empire, and that part of Egypt is done, even though Egypt remains a country and has been the whole time. I know that was really quick. We covered, several hundred years and several dynasties, but that's what that encyclopedia does. It's just a real quick kind of overview. Make sure you're reading the material and you'll get some more knowledge from that. Thanks.